Chapter 19. Monotone. Somehow, I have never forgotten the few moments that separated the part of the story he had just told from what was yet to come. It sits in my mind still, like an intermission separating two parts of a play. Until now, he had been telling me the history of a young man, unbeaten, indomitable. Now the story seemed to fall with the death of the fire before us. As I watched the flames burn down, I was sure of two things. One was that I would never hear anything more important. The other was that I would be in deep trouble when I went home this night. I knew it, but I chose to disregard the fact. The idea of a worried mother and father paled before the scene that was opening for me here. I watched the sick man as he strained for the strength to continue. Great things were happening here, and by some granted power, I was given the privilege to be fascinated by them. The man was hard put about how to continue. He wanted to explain that he hated all white men. That was difficult if you consider that I was the sole audience. He managed. The man and dog stayed in the spot Joe had originally chosen. His instincts had been good. When he took the boat ashore, Joe had looked the area over with an unconscious eye to survival. Now, that foresight was his salvation. The overhanging cliff kept him hidden from people above. The thick reeds screened him from the boat traffic on the river. Several times he could hear strollers on the walk above him, but they went past. Every time this happened, he smiled. He had beaten them, and he grew stronger. It was fortunate that the supply of dried deer meat was sufficient, because during the first weeks, hunting would have been impossible for him. Slow progress made him able to rise for walks that got a bit longer each day. The torn flesh and splintered bones of the young Indian were healing. In several more weeks he would be able to travel on. He knew his destination now, or perhaps his destiny. It was Hunter Island. Joe wished he had thought to bring the medicine with him when he left that home. He remembered Eagle Feather's advice. "Use this only when there is no other way, my son, for when it is finished, there can never be more again." Perhaps it was best that he had not taken the medicine. He would certainly have used it. Now it still remained, safe and intact, in its stone stronghold at the old home. A disturbing reality became more obvious to Joe day by day. The hours of light were growing shorter with each cycle of the sun. Soon Indian summer would end. The days of warmth and comfort were almost over for this year. Even though his body was not fully prepared yet, he would have to move on soon. When he reached Hunter Island, there would be much to do. Joe saw clearly that the ancient story had been very true. The Great Spirit was offering Indian summer, the time when he stopped the progress of seasons, so that Joe could prepare for winter. It was as if his father was reminding him of the day when he had taken Two Trees to the wooded hill. There, Eagle Feather had shown the boy the many signs of autumn. When dusk was falling, Eagle Feather pointed to the sun spirit and showed the boy how far south he had traveled to set. He told Two Trees that even though that spirit tried mightily, as evidenced by his bright red color, only feeble warmth came back to them. When Sun Spirit began his crooked walk, lower and lower to the horizon each day, a wise Indian prepared for what would soon come. But although he felt pleasure in these old thoughts of boyhood, he also found a command. Move now, otherwise you will face starvation and death. During that night, Joe weighed his options. They were few, but life had taught him that it often depended upon some very insignificant detail. He was reasonably sure that he could find his way back to Hunter Island by foot. Once, long ago, he had gotten to this city that way. But there were drawbacks. The miles would not be easy on his partially healed bones. Then, too, there would be the white men along his way. Joe knew that if they interfered with him, he would use both dog and knife. He wanted no more blood or killing. On the other hand, there was the boat. He had never seen the water route around this island and back to his home, but he had the old stories to guide him. Joe knew that he must go to the end of this Manhattan Island, then north and east. The fishermen from Snackapins had traveled to a place called Monaghan, where whirlpools and currents were powerful. That should be easy to find. He would use it as a landmark. Once he had passed through Monaghan, he would be nearly in sight of Snackapins. His father had taken him there as a boy. He would know it when he saw it again. It was late when he slept, but he did so in a peace born of knowledge. He would wade into the river tomorrow and float the canoe. Day broke gray with cold rain, but Joe was glad about it. The mist and sheets of driven spray would make him less visible as he passed the shores of the city. He waded into the water, surprised by its coldness. Winter was closer than he had hoped. But he managed to use his good leg to push enough rocks out of the machoon so that by standing on one side, he could roll it over and let it float to the top. Then he righted the little boat and pulled it to shore. Soon he had it emptied and ready for its journey. He loaded his scant equipment, and he and the dog stepped aboard. It was easy to push off the river, and the current soon had them. All that was needed was the occasional paddle thrust to keep away from the banks. It was well that the river did most of the work here, because Joe soon knew that his injured hand was not healed enough. Going downstream would present little problem, but when he rounded the island, Joe knew he might be required to go against the flow, upstream. What then? An idea started to form, and he decided to implement it now rather than wait until it was crucial. He had the leash that he had made for Kane. With it, he lashed the paddle along his left forearm. That would allow him to use the strength of his arm without using the broken hand. Would it work? Joe dipped the paddle and forced it through the water. It was clumsy, even a little painful, but the bow responded. It would do. Wet and cold though he was in the early winter northeaster, Joe smiled happily. The river would not wash him into the ocean to die. He had won once more at this game of survival. These men had not yet killed Two Trees. Through him, the Indian race still lived. The smile broadened to a laugh, muffled and lost amid the rain and wind. Kane looked up happily and waved her tail at the sound of the master's laughter. The storm worsened through the day, but the graceful little boat was at home on the current of the Hudson. Its low profile caught little wind, and its upturned bow cut most of the waves cleanly. When he realized how well the canoe performed, Joe was glad he had spent the extra days for detail work on this craft. As he reached the end of the island, Joe saw that the waves were still rising. The possibility of swamping was imminent, and would be a poor way to spend the dusk hours. He decided that safety should now take precedence over haste. He would land now and spend this night ashore. But where? There was no spot on the island city where he would spend this or any other night. Danger existed on the storm-ripped river, but he would risk it before the city. He looked away from the shore, and through a rent in the thick squalls, he caught sight of something. Then the storm closed again, and he lost it. Had it been an island? Joe turned the boat away from the sheltering shore to seek it out. Through some combination of skill and luck, he found the island in the mists. Joe pulled the boat ashore, above the raging wave line, and found a sheltered spot among the rocks. There, covered by his bearskin, man and dog weathered the blow. After a while, the wind began to shift. It now came from northwest instead of northeast. It was amazing that those few degrees of direction could have such dramatic effect on the weather. The temperature fell rapidly. A brilliant clearing arc formed below the western clouds and pushed them away. As the last ragged clouds passed overhead, their final raindrops fell as snow. Joe walked around the barren little island. He could do that in a very short time. It was nothing much to speak of, really, only a pile of rocks. He smiled. It would serve for the night. The dry north wind brought a bracing chill. He managed to start a small fire with the damp driftwood along the shore. It dried his clothing quickly. Dried out and warm, Joe walked his little island. When he looked toward the city, Two Trees had the impulse to shake his fist at it, but he resisted. He was free now. He would leave the city and its people behind him. Indian Joe was reborn that morning as Two Trees, Algonquin. That was to be the way he saw himself until he finally joined his ancestors. The next day dawned cold. The stiff breeze ruffled New York Harbor and gave its water a look of nervous motion. Joe noticed clouds of seabirds hovering, diving in various places along the shores. Then the morning sun caught flashing color under one of the nearer clouds. The group of birds pushed toward Joe. They were frantic in pursuit of something. As they came closer, he saw that the birds were screeching and diving over a huge school of fish. The fish cornered their prey against one side of Joe's island, and thousands of mullet ran aground among the weed-covered rocks. Joe watched large fish chase after them and be beached as the waves receded. The predators were striped bass. Thousands of pounds of food lay squirming among the rocks. Joe availed himself of the chance. He gilled a large fish and dragged it to the dry land. It would make a fine meal for him and Connie. Joe walked back to the tide line and marveled at the many schools of bass that were visible from where he stood. He had often fished for the bass with eagle feather, but hadn't imagined that so many of them could possibly exist. Now that he saw the massed migratory schools, he felt strong respect for their tribe. Each year they left Hunter Island in the fall and reappeared in the spring. Two Trees had often wondered where they went. Now he saw that they met here in groups to form themselves into one great clan. Later he watched the schools go up the river. He had come from there, and he wondered where such great numbers of fish would find room to swim abreast in even this broad waterway. He watched more schools of bass enter the harbor. Some came down the river that he would soon travel to reach Monotone, the place of dangerous waters. Others came from the ocean beyond. Again, The surrounding shores were dotted with umbrella-shaped canopies of seabirds. It was amazing to watch the vast groups of fish enter the bay, gather and proceed upriver. Joe was impressed by their apparent purposefulness. The mass seemed to be governed by some intelligence far greater than that of any single fish. They acted in unison to herd and trap the small food fish. Then, when all had eaten well, the bass joined together for their journey north. In the distance, he could see numbers of small boats. The frequent silver flash of sunlight off broad bass scales indicated that men were catching fish from the boats. Joe wasn't surprised. Such great numbers of fish would be obvious even to the city men. A large school was feeding right in front of Joe, and he watched as clouds of bait fish erupted into the waiting birds above. Suddenly, faster than his eye could follow, a path was sliced through the gulls by a hurtling body from higher up. It never slacked its speed, but grazed the water with long talons in reverse direction. It climbed slower than it had dived. The large eagle now carried a striped bass nearly as heavy as the one Joe had captured earlier. She carried her prize to a tall rock nearby and quickly started to devour it. The curved claws and powerful hooked beak made short work of the fish. Soon she had eaten the choicest parts and would leave the rest for later. The chance provided by the annual fall migration was too great to lose by spending her time on a single fish. She rose on broad wings until Joe could only discern her as a speck against the cloudless, delft-colored sky. This time Joe watched closely, hoping to see her majestic dive in its entirety. She circled slowly, surveying the pandemonium of schools below. She chose one. Her mighty wings folded, and the sky hunter became a projectile. Her speed increased as she fell, and again she rose with a large bass securely skewered between her claws. Joe smiled at her success. The feathered creature was a powerful totem animal to the Indians who once lived here. He was happy for her. She would feed and be strong to raise her fledglings in the spring. This was good, for during the years, reflected the man, he had noticed fewer and fewer eagles. This creature that had once given its name to Two Trees' father seemed to have left the places where white men came to live. Joe cooked his fish over the coals of the fire. Later, he and Kane filled their stomachs. He was glad for the opportunity of a good meal. It would give strength for the journey still ahead. Joe noticed that the tide was now in his favor. It would help him along toward Monotone. So the two set off up the East River, passing school after school of striped bass. Joe crossed to the easterly side, where there were fewer signs of men. There were houses, but green patches still stood, in contrast to the gray walls of Manhattan. Joe Two Trees paddled along, under an open, unobstructed sky. No bridge had yet been built to join these shores. On he went, northward, hugging the shore now, to avoid the growing current. The river was becoming so swift here that Joe felt certain he must be nearing Monotone, which the white man calls Hell Gate. The old story spoke of this place as being dangerous in the extreme. It held moving whirlpools so strong that they might easily swallow up a canoe. The current ran in two directions at the same time. The result of this was a violent, confused area of huge waves that might break unpredictably at any time or place within the passageway. All in all, if the old tales proved true, Joe knew he was in for a difficult stretch, but he reserved any opinion until he could see with his own eyes what confronted him. He forced on against the swift, seething flow. Here, he could not even avoid it by staying near the banks. The current's force extended right to the edges, and protruding rocks near shore made it perilous. He was forced to stay closer to the middle now. He rounded a projection of land, and ahead he saw Monotone. There was no possible mistake, and it was every bit as fearsome as it must have been in the days of his ancestors. Their stories had exaggerated little, if at all. Joe had reached Hell Gate, the graveyard of many a vessel much larger than his. His first impression on seeing it was one of utter impenetrability. He steered the canoe into the back eddy of a huge boulder. There, he wedged his bow into a cleft in the stone. The current held him in place as well as any anchor. He wanted time to examine this evil-looking water and decide his course of action. Joe saw the reason for the great currents at first glance. The two sides of the river were constricted here, like the neck of a bottle. At each turn of tide, the vast waters of Long Island Sound were forced to funnel into the river and then the sea. That great volume of water was simply too much to fit comfortably between the narrowed, rocky shores. The result was that the Sound piled higher than the river below it, causing tortured flumes and mighty pressures as it forced through. These would not be relieved until the Sound waters reached a condition of equilibrium with the river. At that point, the turning tide would reverse the situation, piling seawater into the river to accumulate at Hell Gate and force its way back into the Sound. To make matters worse, tides in the different bodies of waters were influenced by either Sound or ocean tides. Since these are never synchronous, the incoming river tide met the still outgoing Sound tide head-on, right here at Monotone. The result of all this was a maelstrom of fury. The Indian was not happy with the facts his observations had served to gather. This spot had every sign of being impassable. The actual length of the constriction was short. Joe could see that if the water was calm, he would be able to traverse it in a few minutes. It wasn't calm, though, and it might just as well have been 1,000 miles long. To abandon his water route toward the old home now could prove to be disastrous. The side of the river where he was now would bring him onto the long sandy land across the water from Hunter Island. From there, it would be extremely difficult ever to recross the Sound without his canoe. If he crossed to the Manhattan side and struck out on foot, he would be in danger from several sources. First, and perhaps most feared, was the menace of now hated whites. Then there was the fact that his poorly healed bones might well be incapable of sustaining his weight for a long overland trek. It was not without some regrets that Joe saw the inevitable. He would either pass through Monotone, or his eventual fate would be a different one than he had planned. Joe leaned his weight back against the bundled skin of Kona the bear. The feeling of it against his shoulders was good. Perhaps some strange magic flowed into the man from its presence, for at that moment he realized that no schools of bass were in view. This seemed somewhat curious in its suddenness. It made him look around for a reason. He hadn't thought the movement of the fish to be important to his problem, so Joe had failed to notice the exact time when they stopped coming downriver. Now he thought more about that fact. They obviously swam with the tide. No fish, given a choice, would swim against this racing force. Then he looked at the rock that held his canoe. A wide expanse of seaweed-covered stones was visible above the waterline. It was nearly low water. The thought came as a great revelation. He had unconsciously assumed that in this place of unnatural waters, Other laws of nature were also suspended. They were not. The unfailing tide still rose and fell, governed by some timepiece greater than any that man had ever made. Low tide was almost here. It was then that Joe must make his try, for any other time would mean sure disaster. The really bad factor was the tide overrun, when the incoming waters met the outgoing. Here at Monotone, there was no period of truly slack tide. Should he be unlucky enough to be at the wrong place when the two actual tides met, the only outcome possible would be catastrophe. But no other choice was given. He prepared himself in the old Indian ways. Joe had never watched a complete cycle of tides in this place, and he had no real knowledge of the right time. The hour, minute, and second that he chose were arbitrary, but the moment came when he deemed circumstances to be most favorable. He freed the boat and pointed it into the still seething waters. He made good progress at first, and could almost see the end of his peril ahead. Then a series of sharp waves appeared to his left, and even as he angled into them, he could tell it was too late. He cut through the first and biggest, but the bow dropped as it passed under his canoe. The next one curled over the upthrust wood and poured a large amount of water into the boat. The dog gave a small yelp at the feel of cold water. Joe forced the now sluggish craft back to its original course and worked to make her cut forward. Now, however, she rode low in the water, no longer the sleek, light boat of a few seconds ago. Joe pushed at the paddle with desperate determination. He gained, but with great effort. Then he looked ahead and saw the gently swelling waters of the Sound. He was almost there. The sight gave him renewed strength, and the distance diminished steadily. Then a long, low wave approached from ahead. There was no avoiding it. He could do no more than meet it and pray. The comber chose the precise instant of meeting his boat in which to crest. It rolled white, foamy water over the entire length of the Machoon. Joe was swamped. The dog paddled along next to him as Joe grabbed for the floating boat. It floated, but only even with the water's surface. The current had them now, and nothing he could do would have any effect. Joe held the boat and floated at the mercy of the tides. He spotted the paddle nearby and swam to grab it. He was able to regain his hold on the boat, but only with difficulty. No other item could lure him away after that experience. Then, floating a good distance off, he saw the bearskin. He judged the speed of the current and length of water, and saw that he would not be able to drag it back even if he reached it. He followed it with sad eyes as it drifted away and was lost. When it was gone from sight, it seemed to take on a meaning more important than during the years he had loved it. Now he thought of it as a harbinger of his doom. Having won the prize, only to lose it, was an almost certain sign from the Maker. Joe made mental preparations for his death. The cold water was weakening him rapidly, and in a short time he was nearly unconscious. Now and then he would look up and think he saw things in the waves ahead. First it was a bear rising to attack. Next he saw men with clubs and knives. A shock of recognition pulled him awake. There, just ahead, was Eagle Feather in the old canoe. Just as when Two Trees was a small child, the father paddled ahead of him. He spoke the old words of encouragement again. It was as it had been. Eagle Feather used to paddle Two Trees out into the Sound and drop him overboard. Then, keeping the canoe a scant distance ahead, he would make the boy swim to shore. Two Trees remembered that he had cried and said he was drowning, but he had always been able to follow the father. The crying had stopped after many such lessons, and he had not drowned. But something else had come of Eagle Feather's training. This boy, this Indian, was a fine swimmer. Two Trees remembered all this as he watched the father pull away from him. He took the filled canoe by its bow and powerfully followed Eagle Feather. The time came when the father's words were distant and indistinct. Joe could tell that he was not able to keep up any longer. At last, he lost Eagle Feather in a swirl of fog. The Indian was certain that his end had come. But the dog barked, waking him from his stupor. She grabbed his sleeve and yanked at it insistently. The semi-conscious man wished this annoyance would go away and leave him to rest. She wouldn't. She pulled until she knew that it would not wake him. Then she boldly took the flesh of her master between her teeth and bit. It had the effect which she hoped. He jerked awake and glared at her. In doing this, he saw that he had pushed his chest up from a bottom. He was on shore. He had been about to drown and die in 6 inches of water. Joe grabbed Kane and hugged her furiously, ignoring the blood running from the wound she had inflicted in order to save him. Joe crawled the rest of the way to dry land and collapsed. While he slept, the dry wind and warm dog saved his life. When he woke, his clothes were still damp and the air temperature was cold. This discomfort was a pleasant sensation for Two Trees, much better than the pervasive cold he had felt in the river. He stood to see what had actually happened and where he was. What he saw did little to encourage him. He had been pushed well east in the Sound, and had accidentally come up on a small rocky knoll. The sun was nearly gone, and soon he would face a night on this tiny rock with no hope of food, fire, or warmth. He had only the dog, Kane, the paddle, and the flint knife, which had miraculously stayed inside his belt. That last item had remained, strangely in his grip, even as he washed ashore. He looked to the waters that surrounded him. Another small island lay a short distance away, and on its rock shore Joe could see the canoe rising and falling as waves hit it. There was his salvation. The thought was both happy and grim. Was the boat still sound? She sat, bouncing on the rocks at the whim of every wave. If those rocks had pounded holes into her bottom, she would serve no further purpose to Two Trees. Also, the boat was several 100 feet away, across the cold water. Could he force himself back into the water? Could he muster the strength to swim across? Doubts swept his mind. They were put to rest soon enough by a gruesome fact. If he did not swim to the boat and find it intact, Joe would spend a short time on the island. Death by freezing or starvation would soon end his stay. The doubts were natural, but the choice was an easy one. He wasted little time. Joe called Kane to his side and made a running dive. The momentum carried him into deep water, and there he started stroking toward the barren rock that held his boat. Cold crept into his already weakened body with the stealth of a hunting wolf. Once inside, it gnawed at his vital organs, causing cramps and other pain. Midway, he felt that reaching the shore was no longer possible. Joe sensed the presence of death. He was not surprised. This dark aura had hovered near him ever since the bearskin had been lost. But another dark angel swam closer by. He was able to seize a fistful of her hair, and together they continued toward the rock. Joe fought for the strength to rise and walk upright to the dry ground. Somewhere in his heritage, surely not in his damaged body, he found it. Shivering wildly, the man went straight to the small, hollow boat. Its shell was fragile. He had built it and knew its weaknesses well. As he approached, Joe tried to keep himself from hoping for a miracle. That way, disappointment might be easier to endure. He reached it. It was badly bruised in several places, and rocks had splintered sections of gunwale, but the all-important hull was still intact. Joe emptied it of water and pulled it above the tide line. He turned and saw the projecting land in the distance. Once it had been Snakkapin's, place of origin of the powerful Turtle Clan. Now it was a signpost, pointing the way home for the last member of that clan. At some past time, a stroke of chance had pushed a large tree along on high storm waves. It had dropped the tree across the highest point of stone, and there it rested until that day. Joe saw the weathered, dry wood and smiled until tears traced their way down his leathery cheeks. The fire was warm and cheering. He collected a few clams and oysters from the rockweed-covered shore, and soon the pair of survivors were eating heartily. The darkness was absolute, unrelieved by the smallest glimmer of moon or stars. Only Joe's tiny fire broke the gloom like a beacon of hope. It would be a cold night, but he knew Kane would warm him. When day came, he could go to the old home easily. The imminence of death became only a memory of something whose threat had not been fulfilled. Joe sat up late that night, staring into the embers. He made his thanks to the Great Spirit for saving him. He recalled a story about these very islands. It was in earlier times, when Indians first came to Wanaka, his old home. They discovered that a mighty battle was being fought here. Tichy-Manitou and Manitou, good and evil, were locked in deadly combat. The winner would rule over the people of this country. Since Manitou was very bad and responsible for such misfortune as death and famine, the Indians sided with the good spirit. For that he loved them, but the evil one was very powerful. The struggle went on for many generations, and the Indians often suffered great hardship on account of it. But one day the evil one was seriously wounded. He broke off the fight and retreated into the thick woods of Wanaka to lick his wounds. It was by sheer chance that a hunting party of Algonquin braves cornered him in a small cave. They managed to tie him up with cords of rawhide and were taking him to the good spirit, when Manitou used one great burst of his awesome strength and broke the ropes. Badly wounded and very weak, he chose to flee rather than stand and fight. Taking the shortest route out of that territory, he ran across the Sound and to Long Island. A very mysterious thing, born of the Black Powers, happened. Every place where the evil foot touched water, a barren, rocky island formed to support it. These became known as the Stepping Stone Islands, and are still called that to this day. Joe's Island was one of these. Joe's Island was one of these. When Manitou reached the far shore, he was not satisfied with simple escape. He now wanted revenge against the spirit and the Indians who had defeated him. He picked up every huge boulder in sight and hurled them back toward Wanaka. Mute evidence of that titanic battle can be seen to this very day in many parts of the Bronx. There is the famous Rocking Stone, which sits perched where it fell in the present Bronx Zoo. It is said that the touch of a small child on the right spot is enough to set this boulder rocking. Yet a farmer with 20 oxen was once unable to tow it off its base of bedrock. Another proof is Split Rock, where Anne Hutchinson, an early settler, hid during Indian raids on her farm. Then there is Glover's Rock, where a handful of Continental militiamen under Colonel John Glover's command held off the vastly superior forces of General William Howe's invasion long enough to allow George Washington to prevent the destruction of his army and the loss of the Revolutionary War. There are other mementos of that ancient bombardment. The Lion Rock, Saxon Stone, Tilly's Rock, all have some part in Bronx history. But they played a part in the older history of an earlier civilization, too. So it was that Two Trees was saved by the footprint of a devil. He sat and pondered that odd circumstance until he felt the cold touch of snow against his face. Joe drew closer to the warming fire and prepared to spend the dark time. Connie crept against his side to make her warmth one with his. The cold was to allow very little comfort during the coming hours, but morning would find them still survivors. More than once, he thought longingly of the lost bearskin, but it was gone now, having become just another part of his past. He had had it, and now it was simply his no more. It was like many vanished things. There were his parents, Tony, Sheila, and now the robe. As was quite typical of my friend Two Trees, he probably resurrected some old Indian saying that night. I imagine it would have translated very roughly into something about spilt milk. That was the way he would have liked me to think he really felt about his past life. I always let him feel that I did, but I knew better. The Joe I knew was a sensitive man. He was a man who had lived so much in his early years and so little in his later life. The violence, romance, and danger of his past were in tremendous contrast to the self-imposed exile at Hunter Island when I knew him. It often happened that I would find my eyes riveted to his face when he told me about some obscure happening of his long ago. He seldom looked at me when he told those tales. His gaze would invariably find the deepest part of the campfire and fix there, as if it was registering incalculably more than flames and ashes. At those tellings, some strange metamorphosis born of his agitation and enthusiasm would, with the help of my boyish imagination, make him into a young brave again. As the flame light danced and flickered, I could often see the years melt from Two Trees until no gray colored his long hair, no wrinkle grooved his leather cheeks. Sometimes when he told me of the past, and especially of Sheila, I noticed great tears well up to reflect the flame images. These he surreptitiously brushed aside, not aware that I had seen. Perhaps those visions of him were only caused by some errant effect of the light or some other odd manifestation of physical law. But I like to think I sometimes saw the Joe of long ago, reliving the happy parts of his poor life. Yes, Joe would have liked me to think him a stoic, putting the past behind and never grieving for its loss. But it simply was not so.